Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to have everyone out here this morning, especially our visitors. We want to welcome you back at every chance. If you're just joining us, we are getting into our third section of our Big Picture series here that I've been doing. And really the goal of this series is to take each book of the Bible one at a time and go through it at a high level. So if you've been coming to our Wednesday night classes, we've been following along with the narrative of the Old Testament. We've been doing a deep dive into all the books of the Old Testament, and we just concluded with Joshua. This series, though, is meant to take a step back and look at the book as a high level. Sometimes when you dive in deep into a book and you've spent weeks in one book, you can almost start to forget where you've started in that book. And so this is really meant to take a step back, look at the book as a whole, and that serves as a guide next time you're going in deep into a book. And so we'll be getting into Leviticus here this morning. Now, Leviticus is a great example of how this type of view of the Bible can be very, very helpful. So far, looking at Genesis and Exodus, again, that's probably been a lot of refresher material for a lot of you since we've just gone over it. But Leviticus is one of those books of the Bible that we tend to avoid, right? Because it's boring, it's lengthy, it can be confusing, and quite frankly, following the New Testament, it feels irrelevant to us nowadays, right? You get in there and it's just rule after rule after rule, and we don't follow those anymore because they apply to the Old Testament. And so we tend to avoid that book. And really, as Christians, we shouldn't be avoiding any book of the Bible. And so hopefully this morning, what this will do is this will help you to be able to approach Leviticus in a way that can connect this to your growth, to your spiritual journey through the New Testament. So let's go ahead and dive into it here. So what is the story so far? Leviticus picks up right after the exodus of the Israelites from their slavery, when God brought them to the foot of Mount Sinai and invited them into a covenant relationship. Now, Israel had quickly rebelled and broke that covenant, and God had wanted for his presence to come and live right in the middle of the Israelite camp in the form of the tabernacle. But Israel's sin had damaged that relationship. And so at the end of Exodus, we see that Moses, as Israel's representative, couldn't even enter into God's presence in the tent. And so the book of Leviticus opens by reminding us of that fundamental problem. If you want to turn over to the first verse of Leviticus, we'll read that together. In Leviticus 1 and verse 1, it reads, "Now the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of the meeting, saying, 'Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when anyone brings you offerings to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of livestock from the herd or the flock.'" Notice, though, what it says here, where the Lord spoke to Moses from. It says, from the tent of meeting. So he called from the tent to him. So the question is, how can Israel, in their sin and selfishness, be reconciled to God and his holiness? And that's really what Leviticus is all about, is how God is graciously providing a way for sinful, corrupt people to live in his holy presence. Excuse me. Oh, and I did want to note real quick that I didn't make these images. I got a lot of these from my source material, which is Bible Projects. So I'm not that good of an artist. Just wanted you to know that. So I want to take a moment before we continue through Leviticus and talk about this idea of holiness, because it's really important to understanding the book as a whole. The word holy simply means set apart or unique. And in the Bible, God is set apart and he is unique because he is the creator of all. He is the author of life itself. And so if God is holy, then everything around God is also holy. It's full of his goodness and his life and his purity and his justice. And so if Israel, who is unjust and sinful, wants to be able to dwell in God's presence, they too need to become holy. Their sin has to be dealt with. And that's what the book of Leviticus addresses. Now, if you take away nothing else from today's sermon, it would be this slide. So really, really focus on memorizing this slide, because this right here is, above all, the most helpful thing that you're going to learn today. And that's the layout of the book of Leviticus. It has this amazing symmetrical design. It explores the three main ways that God helps Israel to live in his presence. So there are two outer sections that describe ritual. The first, in chapters 1 to 7, describes ritual sacrifice. And then in chapters 23 and 25, it describes ritual feasts. Then moving inward, we see chapters 8 to 10, and it talks about how the priests are ordained. And then a matching section in chapters 21 and 23 talks about the qualifications for the priests. Moving further in, we get into two sections about purity. So chapters 11 to 15 talk about ritual purity, and then chapters 18 to 20 talk about Israel's moral purity. And it's all connected in the very center of the book by a section about one specific ritual, which is the Day of Atonement. And then at the very end of the book, Moses concludes and wraps it up with a section on covenant faithfulness. So this is a very helpful diagram because, like I said, when you get into studying Leviticus, it's very easy to lose your place in what you're talking about and what you're even reading. And this serves as a guide to kind of help you make sense of the book as you move your way through it. So let's go ahead and start looking at some of those sections. So in chapters 1 to 7, it looks at ritual sacrifices. This is one of the sections on rituals. And it outlines the 5 types of ritual sacrifices that Israel was to perform. 2 of these were ways that Israel could say thank you to God for his blessings and the things that he's done for them by giving back symbolic tokens of what God has first given them. And so that's through the grain offerings and the fellowship offerings. 3 other sacrifices were ways that Israel could say, I'm sorry to God. And that was through burnt offerings, through purification offerings, and through restitution offerings. And so here, Israel could offer up the lifeblood of an animal while confessing their sin has created more evil and death in God's good world. And instead of destroying this person, God, of course, wants to forgive them, so this animal symbolically dies in their place. It atones for their sin. And atonement simply means to cover up. And so these rituals, the Israelites were constantly being reminded of God's grace, but also of his justice and the seriousness of their evil and its consequences. When something has to die in your place, it reminds them of just how sacred life is and how that is dying in their place rather than them. Now, the second section, talking about rituals, if you remember the slide I showed before, in chapters 23 and 25, it lays out the 7 annual feasts of Israel. And so you had Passover, you had the Feast of Unleavened Bread, you had the Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost, you had the Feast of Trumpets, you had the Day of Atonement, and then you had the Feast of Tabernacles. And each one of these feasts, it retells a different part of the story of how God had redeemed Israel from slavery in Egypt and brought them through the wilderness into the Promised Land. And by celebrating these feasts regularly, Israel would remember who they were, who God was to them, and how they connected with each other. Now, moving into the section about priests. In this first section, you have Aaron and his sons being first ordained to enter into God's presence on behalf of Israel. You see that in chapters 8 to 10. But we'll come back to this in just a minute. In this matching section, you have the qualifications for priests. The priests were called to the highest level of moral integrity and ritual holiness because they represented the rest of the Israelite people before God. And they also represented God to the people. So they're this intermediary. Now we find out why the priest's holiness matters so much when we go back to that other section, right? So we had seen that Aaron and his sons were ordained as priests. But we also see that in this closing end in chapter 10, we see how two of Aaron's sons, they waltzed right into God's presence. They violated the rules that he had outlined for them, and they were struck down and consumed on the spot by God's holiness. So I don't know how many of you remember, we've gone over it a lot in our Wednesday night class about this particular offense where Nadab and Abihu, they had offered up, it said, strange incense and smoke to God through the incense burners. And so they were consumed on the spot. And we talk a lot about that when we use that as an example of why following God's rules to the letter matters so much, right? It mattered even more in those times for those priests. It's a haunting reminder of the paradox of living in God's holy presence, because God's pure goodness becomes dangerous to those who rebel and insult his holiness. And so it's very important that Israel's priests become holy. And so it's also important that all the people become holy as well. And that's what the next intersections are about. Chapters 11 to 15 are about the ritual purity, as I said before. And then you have the matching section about moral purity. And underneath all of that impurity and purity language is this. God is holy, as we said before, and he's set apart, and Israel needs to be in that holy state as well, right? Being pure or clean, as it's often called in the Old Testament, means that God's presence is off limits to anyone who is not in that holy state, or being unclean or impure. And there are a couple different ways that are outlined in Leviticus that you can become impure. You can get into this unholy state. And that's what the first section is about. A couple of the ways are by having contact with reproductive fluids, having a skin disease, touching mold, or touching dead bodies. Now, those first four things are all associated with mortality and the loss of life. They symbolically represent death, right? The opposite of life. Now, it's important to note that being unclean or impure was just a temporary state, okay? That wasn't a sin in and of itself. Being unclean or impure was not a sin. It only lasted a week or two, and then it was over. What was a sin, what was wrong, was to waltz into God's presence carrying these symbols of death, of uncleanness, of impurity on your person into God's holy presence. Now, there was one last way that you could become impure, and that was by eating impure animals. That's where we get all the kosher food laws. They're all found right there in that section. And there have been a lot of different theories as to why those particular animals resulted in being impure, why they were off limits. One of the thoughts is that it was to promote hygiene. You know, a lot of those animals carried disease or parasites or things that were unhealthy for you, that their technology back then just didn't have a way to overcome. There's been theories that it had to do more with cultural taboos. But Leviticus really doesn't go into detail as to the why. It simply isn't descriptive enough to let us know. But the basic point of having all of these impurity laws is really clear. Altogether, these work as an elaborate set of symbols to remind Israel that God's holiness was to affect all areas of their life. They were to remain clean and pure through all aspects of their life. Now, the matching section is about Israel's moral purity. The Israelites were called to live differently from their neighbors in the surrounding lands at the time, different from the Canaanites. They were to care for the poor instead of overlooking them, as was often the case in other lands. They were to have a high level of sexual integrity, and they were to promote justice through their entire land. Okay? So they were to set themselves apart from the rest of the people. Remember, we've talked about before that Israel was supposed to be God's chosen people. They were supposed to show exactly what a good relationship with God was like to all the other nations, so that all the other nations would want to be like them. Now, at the very center of the book, we find a long description of one of Israel's ritual feasts, the Day of Atonement. The odds were that every Israelite's sin was not covered through their individual sacrifices. And so once a year, the high priest would take 2 goats, and one of these would become the purification offering, to atone for the sins of the people, to cover up for them. But the other was called the scapegoat. And so the priest would confess the sins of Israel, and he would symbolically place them on this goat, and then it would be cast out into the wilderness. And this was a very powerful image of God's desire to remove sin and its consequences from his people so that they could live together in peace. Now, as I said before, the book concludes with this little afterword by Moses, and it's this call to covenant faithfulness. He's describing the blessings of peace and abundance that would result if Israel obeyed all of the laws. But he also warns them that if they're unfaithful and they dishonor God's holiness, that it would result in disaster and ultimately exile them from the land promised to Abraham. So if you want to see how Leviticus fits into the big story here, it's helpful if we look at the first verse of the next book of the Bible. So if you want to turn briefly over to Numbers 1, verses 1. It says, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tent of meeting, on the first day of the 2nd month, in the 2nd year that they had come out of the land of Egypt." It says that he spoke to Moses from in the tent. So the book of Leviticus, it worked. Its whole purpose was to allow God's presence to dwell with these people because they were unholy and they needed to become holy. They were impure and they needed to become pure. Remember, at the very beginning, God's voice called out from the tent to Moses. But now we see that he's talking to Moses from in the tent. They can finally bridge this gap. And that's really what Leviticus and all the rules inside are meant to accomplish, is to create a way for Israel's sin to be covered up so God can live with his sinful people in peace. When you think about New Testament Christians, we don't follow Leviticus to create that bridge. Instead, that bridge can be summed up in just one word: Jesus. Everything that's contained within Leviticus is symbolic in some way of Jesus or of our relationship with Jesus or what he does for us. Think about some of the things. He is our scapegoat, right? He took on the sins of all of us so that we could become pure. He died in our place. Instead of having all these annual feasts, we have a weekly day, or we have a weekly ritual where we remember him, which is what we just did this morning with communion. He is our high priest. He intercedes on our behalf. So we don't have the entire priesthood like we did before in the high priest. We have Jesus in our place. Jesus bridges the gap for us. In the Old Testament, they had Leviticus to spell out all of this, and it became very burdensome for them because there are so many rules in there. If you take a deep dive into it, there was a lot to remember. Jesus makes God's presence accessible for all of us today in a way that's easy and convenient for us. As a New Testament Christian, Leviticus is a reminder for us in the same way that the Israelites had so many different reminders for them. it's a reminder for us about all that God has done for us and all God is willing to do for us to bridge the gap for us today. He had to do all this just for his chosen people, the Israelites. And we, as Gentiles, came much, much later than that. But this is a way for him to bridge the gap even to us and to bring forward his blessing that we all lost because of our own sin and rebellion. And so I hope that this morning I've been able to make Leviticus just a bit more approachable to you. It will still probably be dry and a little boring when you read through it and you go verse by verse, and it might feel a little tedious. But hopefully, using this as a guide, you can see how the book ladders up and is applicable to our life today. Because it keeps explaining how God is persistent in trying to make sure that all of us are saved. It explains how God has great love for each and every one of us, and that he's not willing for any of us to die. He wants all of us to be saved. This morning, if there is anyone who hasn't been saved, we have a way to fix that. As I said before, we have Jesus. Jesus is our bridge today so that we can dwell in God's presence. And so if you have any need this morning, if you need to start your journey through Christ, you can come forward and let it be known. If there is anything that you are struggling with where you simply need prayers of the congregation, you can come forward and let that be known while together, while we stand and while we sing.